and still is, in a sense, a journalist with us at WAIS. And his topic is journalism, past, present, and future.
Personally, I'd rather listen to David than me. Speaking of people that, I brought along some newspapers from my newspaper days in Dallas, and speaking of people that lost their office because of cheating taxes, I brought these along mostly because I pulled these out of the tub in my attic this week, and mostly I wanted to illustrate, well, things seem to change, they never really change. India blitzes into East Pakistan. This is 1971. We've still got politicians. We've got a U.S. Attorney General that's held in contempt of Congress. We've got, this goes back to Agnew, which in my younger days, as a young jock, right out of college, I played golf with a guy a couple of times in Palm Springs. And I thought at the time, I was 23, 24 years old, I was thinking, this guy's a real crook. He just smelled like his trips to Palm Springs in that year were this is a fun headline. And I have stories and photographs, most in all of these at some point. Played golf with this guy one year in the Bob Hope Desert Classic. And this fella is my congressman, Congressman Sam Johnson from Plano, Texas. And he was held as a POW in North Vietnam for 7 years. And he has the same affliction as McCain in terms of he can't use his right hand from torture. And this was the year that there were price controls put on the sale of energy in the United States. That was when Nixon fixed the price of energy, oil, and it didn't really work too well. He also froze wages that year, and my anecdote from that is that year I won a lot of awards as a journalist, and that year by law, by executive order, my raise was limited to 2%. And the company Drunk, who was coincidentally the Night City editor, got a 2% raise. And he showed up most nights drunk, and he could do a very good job drunk. I never saw him sober in 5 years. But what I wanted to talk about is, well, first thing is when John suggested I present something to this group, it was intimidating, because I feel like I'm the Wolowitz of the Big Bang Theory. I'm the only guy here without a PhD. It seems that way to me, or a JD. And I started thinking about when Ronald Hilton invited me to join back in the late 1990s, and what a good coach he was, because initially I was sort of a Russia expert, and I would submit things that maybe were a little controversial, and Ron was very good at leading me toward an accurate yet tactful post. He was a good teacher. He never told me I made a mistake, but he always taught me how to work around those mistakes. That was his amazing talent as far as I was concerned. Moving on, before we decide what journalism will become, we must know what it was and what it currently is. To the uninitiated, journalism seems like a simple matter, but it's really a very complex ballet at a newspaper in the 1970s with many people. I was hired by the publisher of a major metropolitan daily, the Dallas Times-Herald. We had a daily subscription of about 350,000 and about 450,000 on Sunday. I was hired as a photographer, but eventually migrated to doing double duty as a writer and a photographer, and they really liked that because they could send one person out in one car to do the story, and I'd come back with a photo. I could process the film, write a caption, and then go write a story. in pretty short order, so they saved a lot of money on me. Competition for the Sunday front page, or the front page of the Metro section, or the sports section, or the women's section. In those days they called it the women's section, was intense. There were 35 or 40 reporters, about 15 specialized sports writers, a society editor. Everybody wanted a front page story. It was a big deal. I figure in 5 years I had 5,000 to 6,000 bylines. Every day the routine was come to work, they give you 5 short stories to write or rewrite. It might be a wire story that ran 20 paragraphs and they only have room for 3 or 4, and they would say, Black, rewrite this, cut it down. And then once a week we had to do a full-blown feature. So you had to go out and find an idea, or somebody would suggest an idea, and you would develop it, go take the picture, do the interview, do the face-to-face. The blessing in all this is I met some fascinating people. I interviewed people like Mickey Mantle, Lyndon Johnson, feminist Gloria Steinem, Lee Trevino, Arnold Palmer, Jack Nicklaus, because I had a golf background. They sent me on a lot of golf stuff. I even covered the 100th British Open in Royal Birkdale, and it was won by my old pal Lee Trevino, who as a 16-year-old I caddied for Lee in the very first PGA event he ever played in. And he's the same guy in 1962 that he is today. He's just a lot wealthier. I had to drive him to that golf, the Dallas Open, in my '49 Ford because he was too poor to have a car. He had been given a sponsor's exemption by the local Host Pro to play in it. And he's a fascinating guy, good guy. If I saw him today, I haven't seen him in 10 years, he would say, Randy, what the hell are you doing in Adrian? He said that to me in Chicago. He said that to me in Royal Birkdale, in Southport. He's a heck of a guy. I even interviewed W.C. Field's mistress. Really. And there was a song in the 1960s by the Statler brothers called Whatever Happened to Randolph Scott? Well, a few years out of college, I played with Randolph Scott in the Bob Hope Classic. And he was 6'2", slender, handsome, silver-haired, very nice man. Once I figured out his affliction, I would say, Mr. Scott, it's a pleasure to meet you, and he'd look past me. Or I'd say, nice shot, Mr. Scott, and he would ignore me. And then somebody in the distance who apparently knew him said, Randy, Randy! That's what they called him. And I realized he was stone deaf. He never heard me greet him. He never heard me compliment his swing. And so I made sure the rest of the round, when I said something to him, I was standing right in front of him. And whatever happened to Randolph Scott, until the day he died, he was playing golf 6 days a week in Palm Springs, California. One day I was playing with him, and he said, I've got a friend that's going to join us on the 3rd hole. He's staying in one of the rental properties on the golf course. We'll pick him up when we go past him on the 2nd hole. It was Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was unemployed in those days. It was between the time he was a governor and that he became a politician. Equally a real gentleman. Later, as a stringer for UPI, I quit the newspaper because I just couldn't make enough money with 2% raises. I worked for UPI Dallas, covered national political conventions, NFL and NCAA sports, 5-alarm fires. There was always one of those. And plus I met all these really, really interesting people. The reporting process was very complex. The most important thing, of course, the publisher told me, was to spell everybody's name right. And as a young cub reporter, I went out one night to cover a stabbing in a bar, and I came back and wrote the article, and the fellow's name was Jerry Smith, the dead guy. And the Night City editor said, what did McKnight tell you about checking the names? Did you check the spelling? And I said, Smith, S-M-I-T-H. And he says, are you sure? It's before cell phones. I couldn't call the bar and ask him, what about that guy with the knife in his chest? So I had to drive back to South Dallas, which was kind of like driving into Cicero on Saturday night in Chicago, and find out that it had an E on the end. So who would have figured a black guy would have it spelled the English way, or what it was. But anyway, once you submitted your story, it went through the process of editing, typesetting, composing on old linotype, hot type machines. We went to the place where they cast the plates. The plates got loaded onto the presses. Someone loaded tons and tons of newsprint, and they would run off 100,000 newspapers an hour. So for a 250,000 run, about 2.5, 3 hours, assuming nothing broke. Then the bundlers would wrap wire around every 50 papers, and the loaders would put them on the trucks, and the trucks would drop the bundles off on street corners all over Dallas County. And then as a 12-year-old kid, I would come along with my bicycle and my canvas paper bag and pick my bundles and roll them up, put a rubber band around them, and deliver 78 papers in about an hour and a half in North Dallas. So the $300 million newspaper in the 1970s was dependent on a 12-year-old boy with a bike and a canvas bag, a box of rubber bands, who was only thinking about girls. And hence some of those papers ended up in somebody's flower bed or on their roof, because we threw it. And it wasn't delivered in a car. The only difference between us and the Dallas Morning News was those kids all had to have a driver's license, because they're working in the middle of the night. They ran bigger routes, and we worked 7 days a week for about $1 per paper per month. So we got about half of the subscription rate. If it was $2 a month, I got $1. Of course, I had to not just throw the paper 7 days a week, I had to collect once a month. And our newspaper rate was $1.99 a month in 1958. And I had more than one customer that would give me $2 and say, "Keep the change, kid." And I made sure his hit the mud puddle every time. The fact that it was all dependent on children, literally, has always amazed me. That you've got publicly traded corporations that get down to that level. That was then. Even earlier, in 1731, there was a fellow named William Cosby. He was the king-appointed governor of New York State in the colonies, and he had an adversary named Rip Van Dam. Rip Van Dam was the acting governor between the time that the king appointed Mr. Cosby, who was apparently a real SOB, and the time he arrived in New York to take over the job. And he decided that the money that Van Dam had been collecting during this 3 or 4 month gap was his, and Van Dam wouldn't turn it over to him, so he sued him in New York court. He knew that he couldn't win before a jury, so he immediately went to the provincial Supreme Court that had 2 of his friends out of the 3 on it, and asked them to issue a directive to turn over the money. They voted 2-1 to do that, and the Chief Justice was a fellow named Morris, and he voted against it. And Cosby very publicly demanded to know of the Chief Justice why you voted against me. Rather than reply directly to Governor Cosby, he had his opinion published in a pamphlet that was printed by a fellow named John Peter Zenger. Zenger didn't like Cosby either, and he and Morris, who was then removed from the Supreme Court by the governor, and a fellow named William Bradford, who was the printer for the New York Gazette, they started publishing their own little newspaper that attacked Cosby constantly. A couple of years goes by, and Cosby files suit against this newspaper and John Peter Zenger for seditious libel. A grand jury refused to issue an indictment, so he made his friends on the provincial Supreme Court issue a bench warrant, and on November 17th, Zenger was arrested and his bail was set at £800, which in 1733 was a heck of a lot of money, apparently. During the trial, the Supreme Court disbarred the 2 attorneys that Zenger hired, and so he hired a 3rd attorney. He managed to pack the jury with all of his pals, and this fellow named Andrew Hamilton, defended him, and he made a summation that was quite eloquent, I read. And he admitted, Zinger said these things, this libel. He said this, but you can't prosecute this man under English law in New York State. That was the principle. And he says, plus everything he said was the truth. I can prove it. And this was a novel concept to try to get them to charge him under New York law, which really didn't exist in 1733 to the level that it does, that it did later after the fact. The concept that the truth is its own defense was not an established law until this trial. And the jury, who was all on Cosby's payroll, ruled against Cosby and ruled that the truth was a valid defense for libel, a charge of libel. And that started the press freedom. Press freedom started to blossom in the United States, or in the colonies. A half century after the Zinger trial, as the first Congress debated the proposed Bill of Rights, one of the Constitution's principal drafters and the great-grandson of Lewis Morris, that Supreme Court justice from New York, wrote of the Zinger case, the trial of Zinger in 1735 was the germ of American freedom, the morning star of that liberty which subsequently revolutionized America. The sidebar on that is Lewis Morris's great-great-grandson is credited with writing, the guy that wrote this summation, he's credited with writing the preamble to the Constitution. That was then. And it brings us to journalism of the 2000s. Today, journalism is quickly changing its stripes, habits, and practices. It seems that most of the news these days is of the instant variety. We're flooded with CNN, we're flooded with blogs, and therein is the problem for me. Blogs are written by legitimate journalists and quacks. You can't tell the difference most days. You don't know if the blog is written by a college-educated writer who has a real editor who has a legitimate background, or perhaps by a high school dropout with no real job, no office, no training, no car, and no credibility. It's difficult to distinguish the difference a lot of the time. I read a lot of posts on the WAIS side, as you know, and we all cite, most of the time we all cite our sources. The challenge is determining the credibility of those sources. The problem is you really have a better chance of teaching a pig how to ride side saddle than you do of finding out if it's a valid source, unless you check. Now, how do you check? You've got to ask Google the right question. You've got to know how to word the question. You have to. Don't accept everything that pops up in your inbox as gospel, even if it's the sort of thing that fits your personal political profile. Be cautious about emails that link to seemingly credible news sources. I've got a good friend that sent me an email last week that equated Obama and George Soros. Well, it equated the two together, which is rightfully so, because Soros has funded a lot of the Democratic causes. But it linked Soros to the Nazis as a cooperative party during the Nazi occupation of Hungary. Now, Soros was 14 years old in those days. And a little research on my part said, who didn't want to cooperate with the Nazis when they threatened your family and you're 14 years old? They're not justifying what he may have done or not done, but the point is, you don't know that until you ask the question. I've taught myself to ask questions of Google in a manner that the internet search engine can understand. But the bottom line is, if it smells, it smells. So here's my summation. Dr. Randy Reddick is the chairman of the journalism school at Texas Tech. He told me several years ago we'll live to see a journalism world in the United States that features only 4 or 5 national newspapers, but hundreds of local weeklies. The Wall Street Journal, USA Today, the New York Times, and perhaps a few other newspapers will survive, because they'll figure out how to interpret the challenge that the internet presents as it presents itself to the print publications. Local weeklies will survive, Dr. Reddick told me, because they deliver local value to local readers that major dailies can't afford to provide because it's too expensive to staff up. In a metropolitan area of 7 million people like Dallas-Fort Worth, there's 100 suburbs. Each suburb has a high school, a school district. Each high school has each district has its own. Each suburb has its own people that die, obituaries, social things, weddings, all the stuff that is a proximity interest to the local people. Big city newspapers just can't do it anymore. If you look through the Old Times Herald on Sundays, there's a wedding section. There's a section. There's a society section. The Dallas Women's Club, the Cotillion, the Junior League, the Symphony Guild, all that sort of stuff. They can't afford to do that anymore, but weeklies can. And so Dr. Reddick seems to think that in 5 to 10 years we'll have a lot of little weeklies around the country, but very few print publications, if any. I'm skeptical. I don't think the New York Times will survive. I think I'll live to see the Dallas Morning News shut down. Even USA Today, if you look at it, gives 1 or 2 paragraphs in every edition about states. They have a story about 4 guys got murdered in Paris, Texas last night. That's all they've got for the whole state of Texas for a day. For better or for worse, you're going to get your news electronically pretty quick if you're not already getting it. I haven't subscribed to the Dallas Morning News in about 15 years. I read it online every morning. Most of them are free, and if I want to read about who's got the prettiest garden in Allen, Texas, or how big our high school marching band is, by the way, it's 850 musicians. We've got 92 trombones in our high school marching band. And yes, they play the song 76 trombones at the first home game every year. We get that news from our local rag that's thrown on my front lawn every Thursday, and I read it. It's only got about 6 pages of news, but it's local stuff. And if they teach you anything in journalism school, they teach you proximity. The people want to know what's going on in Dallas. They want to know this is Colonel Sam Johnson. He was held for 7 years in a POW camp in North Vietnam, and they want to know now he's 74 years old or 75 years old, and he's a United States Congressman. The Herald and the News had a policy of they have a national story, a local story, and a global story on the front page every day. Ford becomes president. Nixon could quit. But here, there's school taxes, wholesale prices, and the really fun part is to read the ads. You'll find that a black and white console TV in 1971 in Dallas cost $178, black and white. Has a mechanical channel changer. Any questions? Yes, sir. Sure. Yes, sir.
I was just thinking, it's the eternal question. I mean, maybe because I wasn't involved in the esoteric stuff, so to see these things. It's been happening. I know in the TV business, as a friend of mine pointed out, anchored in the space, that they keep getting these consultants coming in, and they say, this is your square, and this is your city. And the further you get away from the square, the fewer viewers you're going to have, so you've got to keep it all pretty much local. The problem is there's so many things going on in the world. And I think that in a real sense, I think Americans as a whole, I mean, we are very insular. But we know less about the world than most people know about the world. I mean, it is natural that people in
Well,
Should be is a ridiculous word.
you're absolutely right. The question, if I understand you, is that why are we as Americans ignorant of the news outside our borders?
Actually, outside our town, but outside our rules.
I was talking to the bartender at Caesar's Windsor night before last. I came in a couple of days early and I wanted to just be a tourist for a change. And so this woman's about 40. She told me about her 21-year-old daughter. I told her about my soon-to-be 13-year-old daughter, and she asked me if I'd traveled a lot, and I said I moved to Russia 20 years ago, and I happened to mention, and I'm not sure why I brought it up, but I mentioned that even 3 years after I moved to Russia, that Lenin's likeness was still on the currency. So this had been 1995. I said Lenin's, and she said, why would they have John Lennon's picture? And I looked, I said, you're kidding, right? You're kidding. She wasn't kidding. But the real, yeah, I mean, so I don't think it's just us individually that are not aware of our surroundings. Now, we're all aware of our surroundings. You can probably find, this is a brain trust of global academics, people that are experts on every conceivable subject, from theology to gambling, in a lot of different countries. I mean, gosh, you guys have been, I've been to 40 countries, but I bet collectively someone in here has been to every country on earth and knows what's going on. I mean, goodness, we've got people here that are experts on Islam and everything else in between. And it's a blessing. But, you know, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Here you've got a headline with Agnew resigning for tax evasion, and if you look right under it, it says Israeli jets strafe Syria. This is October 10th, 1973. I mean, this nonsense is still going on. There's no end in sight. Yes, sir.
Growing up, I used to grew up with Tom Brokaw, Peter Jennings, Dan Rather in the 80s, and it was always my sense that they were, to some degree, apolitical or objective.
Yeah, Cronkite, for instance.
Cronkite, yeah. When is your sense, as a professional journalist, that it started to really change? It even changed with Dan Rather. But when did you start to note this shift from the real effort at objectivity and apolitical reporting to a point, to where now, like, I live in Washington, D.C., there's the liberal rag, the Washington Post, there's a conservative rag, the Washington Times, and I literally do sometimes compare them. I mean, just blatant ideological and political.
I think it changed about the same time Ronald Hilton started to allow us, members of WAIS, to use the term lying politician. There was a noticeable change in the style of the site when Bush 43 was being attacked by the liberals, and Rather, for instance, ran that thing with some military guy who claimed that the family had used his influence to keep him out of some unpleasant military thing. Now, the guy was a fighter pilot. I mean, he wrote a rocket. It was an incredibly dangerous thing, and to be an instrument-rated fighter pilot, to fly in all weather, whether you were flying over the Gulf of Mexico or Vietnam, it's an incredibly risky business, and it takes somebody that's pretty quick-witted to navigate such an environment. I fly 172 Cessnas, and I know I've got my hands full. This guy was riding a rocket, but they started attacking Bush openly, and in WAIS, people started calling the President of the United States a draft dodger, a liar. We were a little more gentlemanly before that era, so I think maybe you could say during Clinton, because the conservatives attacked Clinton. I saw a bumper sticker a year ago in Dallas that said, vote vote for Monica's boyfriend's wife for president. Yes, sir. Thoreau.
So, Sister Sarah Taylor teaches us to call it the mainstream media, which is a critique that can be articulated both from the left and the right. My question is less about Palin or the politics of the left and right, more about it seems that there's been a trend towards concentration of media ownership in the last several years, and there's like maybe 4, 5, 6 conglomerates that now own the vast majority of the media sources that we generally consume now. The Washington Post just went out of private ownership recently, for example. What effect do you think that kind of concentration of ownership of media, whether it be print or broadcast journalism or whatever else, has had on the way that news is produced, consumed, interpreted?
So the question is concentration of media ownership by mega corporations, and is it having an effect? I have to retrospect to the Dallas Times-Herald. The Dallas Times-Herald was privately owned for 100 years, and in 1973-ish or 4, I could be a bit off on that, we were bought by the Times-Mirror Corporation, who immediately installed Tom Johnson as our publisher and executive editor, and he pushed 2 older publisher editors aside. And Tom Johnson had taken one journalism course at the University of Georgia, I think, and he couldn't even write an editorial. They actually hired a ghostwriter to write the Sunday editorial. And other than him needing help writing a complete sentence, he eventually became president of CNN. But other than him having this title, the street reporters never noticed any kind of a difference. This was in the early 70s, mid-70s. We never noticed a difference in editorial style. The Morning News was considered the conservative paper in town, and the Times-Herald was considered a little less conservative, not really liberal. Texas was undergoing a political shift, a paradigm shift in politics. We went from being principally an agrarian state with the Democrats controlling the state because they controlled the boondocks, to being a pretty conservative state that would elect a Republican governor. We had a woman governor, first woman, and the whole state shifted from being my grandfather's state of a bunch of what we call yellow dog Democrats. They were so concerned about, they were so committed to the liberal cause, you'd vote for an old yellow dog if it ran under the Democratic ticket, to more of a yellow dog Republican. But we didn't notice any difference. When Tom Johnson from the LA Times-Mirror Corporation came in, there was no change, other than we knew we'd be in business for a while. Dallas Morning News, the surviving paper, is now, it's owned by the Belo Corporation, which is a New York Stock Exchange thing. They own about 50 or 60 newspapers around the country, and a couple of dozen TV stations, and scads of radio stations. And I haven't really noticed anything change out of the Dallas Morning News, other than the corporation spun off the newspaper. They're clearly worried about their financial liability because their circulation's down, as are all print publications. Nobody's showing growth. I can't talk to the politics of, you're talking about somebody like Murdoch. I just don't see it. I don't see that influence. Yes, sir.
Yes. This is a kind of a follow-up to these letters of questions, and I'm wondering whether people may regret or rue the politicization of the daily newspaper, the press generally, electronic media will always produce. But the origins of the American newspaper were in heavy-duty political advocacy. I mean, you can look not only at the Zenger case, but also what was going on in the 1800 election between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, where people said that, like, Thomas Jefferson was the only person who could assist us in a cesspool in the Abbey or something like that.
organization.
I mean, journalism after World War II became somewhat more homogenized. People tried to keep papers of record and objective, and certainly, but that was also met with a decline in the number of newspapers. Back when Agnew was quitting, there were about 1,760 newspapers now. I mean then, and now there's probably fewer than 1,500. So there's been about a 20% decline in the number. Is there a chance that, like the Koch brothers, who have been mentioned as possible purchasers of, for instance, the Chicago Tribune, which has just gone through bankruptcy, is there a chance that their deep pockets can actually save print journalism, and that they don't need to worry about where their next meal's coming from? They're not like the Chandler family in L.A. or the family that owned like the Nashville, Tennessee, and the Louisville Courier Journal, both of which were highly regarded newspapers.
The question is, can they make a comeback
Well, I mean,
with somebody that's got...
rather than this, so-called objectivity, which is what people were thought of, that was distinguishing daily journalism.
I don't know how to address that. I know that after last week I was accused of watching too much Fox News. I decided to figure out which channel it was and watch it for a couple of days. Because we have 6 principal TV stations in Dallas. They have 40, but there's 6 that people, 4, 5, 8, 11, 13, and 39, which is CBS, ABC, Fox News, NBC, and a couple of public television stations. And I, quite frankly, I didn't know where Fox was. And as I said in one of my posts, if I've watched Fox, it's probably by accident. Somebody sent me a link to a story. I know that right now a lot of networks are, well, I know right now that the Obama administration is hiring a lot of print journalists and broadcast journalists out of legitimate media outlets, and I'm not quite sure why, but the record shows that more than 60 legitimate journalists have been hired away from their career path into politics in the last 12 months. And I don't know what to make of that, other than you got to get your message out. And the one thing that Obama's really good at is making a speech. And I used to kind of count the 10. There's 10 elements of propaganda. There's 10 tools used that we learned in journalism school. Glittering generalities. Lyndon Johnson was the master of that. You can use all kinds of flowery language to get the reader's attention and trust. The bandwagon technique. Right now, the liberals in the world are in the country are trying to get us to sign on to Obamacare because everybody's signing on. So it's get on the bandwagon. They very seldom, in my student days, the politicians very seldom badmouth their opponent. They do anything to not mention their name. Pepsi never talked about Coke until about 1975 or 80. And then they started running comparison tests and said most people prefer Pepsi over Coke. But in the 60s you never heard something like that. Politicians now attack their opponents and say some pretty unpleasant things. And I regret that. I said a prayer for Obama when he was elected, that he would be a good president. I'm not happy with the way it's turning out, but I was pulling for him. And I'm a prove it to me sort of person.
Quick question.
Yes, sir.
John, you brought up the idea of consolidation of media. And I had the fortune to listen to Mike Nichols speak and part of his presentation was the demise of the dispatch offices. There'd be a Singapore office, and I forget, maybe I got the term wrong, dispatch offices. What's that?
Foreign correspondence.
Foreign correspondent offices, yeah, and more would be dependence on individual writers that live in these countries, that foreign, they call them expats or whatever, people who have a knowledge of politics and again, it's a cost saving message, but the other part of another part of Mr. Nichols' presentation
let me give you one last short anecdote about on that topic.
That's sort of an observation, but if it's a.
In about 1975, the great-granddaughter of the founder of the Dallas Morning News was kidnapped and held for ransom in Dallas. Her name was Mandy Dealey. I actually went to high school with her. So she was kidnapped and held for ransom, and the kidnappers said to the two newspapers, if you mention this in your newspapers, we'll kill her. They didn't want anybody to know about it, especially the police. Well, that was the Dallas Morning News. Now, I worked for Felix McKnight, who was the executive editor and co-publisher of the Dallas Times Herald, and he was her she was his goddaughter. What do you call it?
Yes, goddaughter.
Yeah. Okay. He was her godfather.
She was his godchild.
Godchild, that's it. Okay. So I knew about the kidnapping because I had a buddy over at the Morning News that knew about it, and he told it. We cooperated with each other to some degree. I asked Felix, and I called him Felix because I knew him as a golfer. And I said, are we going to run a story? I mean, you've got the scoop, and we're a PM paper. She was kidnapped after the morning paper was already on the streets. So they knew it. We knew at 10 o'clock in the morning that she had been kidnapped. And our paper doesn't go to press till about 12:30 or 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And that's just the Bulldog edition, the first edition that goes on the buses. And we had 3 other editions that would follow right up to about 3 o'clock. And I said, are we going to run it? He says, no. I mean, I'm her godmother. She's like my child. We're family. And I'm not going to do anything that might cause her demise. We had just been bought by the Times Mirror, and they hadn't brought in Tom Johnson. He hadn't arrived. So this thing that went on for about 3 days, and eventually she was released. And I don't know to this day if a ransom was paid or not, but I know that Tom Johnson came to work the following week, and he found out that Mr. McKnight sat on that story for 3 days, and he was retired. He wasn't fired, he was retired. That was the press release. He's going to pursue new opportunities. He was 68 years old. He wasn't going to,
All right, thank you, Randy. Excellent.
If anybody wants to look through these papers, I'll have them here for the rest of the day.
One of our guests of honor, well, you're all guests of honor, but one of our guests of honor is Mr. Buddy Wolodarski, who has flown in from Vienna, and he has had an illustrious and fascinating life. I've learned many things about